Hey, welcome, good afternoon. Welcome to this Network ThinkIn with the People's Powerhouse. I'm David Taylor, one of the editors at Tortoise. And we're sort of coming to the end of a run of discussions we've been having about really what opportunities COVID-19 and the pandemic has put in play for us. We've been having a series of discussions around issues like levelling up and devolving power from Westminster, and we wanted to finish this series with this, just a discussion around this quite radical question of should the North of England try an experiment with a universal basic income? And I know we've got some people with us today who ardently think that that should be the case and that we should have an experiment with it. And we'll just sort of try and have a conversation where I think we dig into what it is we think we mean by that, how it works, and whether or not there are any models around the country and indeed the world for leading us to think that it is a good way forward. So just a bit of housekeeping before we go. I think if you've not been to a ThinkIn before, although we do have some great guests today who can help us shape the conversation, we want to hear from everybody. It's not intended to be a passive free ride, this one. We want to hear from you. The whole kind of model really for this is a news meeting at a media company, and what we're trying to do is we come in with a question, we hopefully hear from some people who know a thing or two, and we get to a better place by the end of it. And the idea is that it might shape some future journalism for us. And so, again, I just want to whiz you through a little bit of Zoom etiquette. I'm sure you've been spending your life on this thing for the last few months, but just to remind you, we're going to have automatically muted you when you join. So, but that doesn't mean you can't shout when it comes to your moment. We're going to probably use the chat function quite well during this conversation. My colleague Tom is going to be moderating that, and it's often, there he goes, hi Tom. Yeah, more often than not, that's where the interesting conversation gets started, and hopefully Tom usually does a good job of nudging me to say, you really need to go and speak to this woman or this guy, because they're saying all the right things. So we'll keep an eye on that. So just shout in there. And obviously, if you're feeling a little bit shy and you don't want to talk, then you can comfort yourself in perfecting it in there. And then again, if you're familiar with this, if you click on the participants button at the bottom, you'll see everyone who's on the call, and you'll also see there's a little blue hand that you can play with. And if you want to have a crack at that, you can alert us to your the fact that you want to say something. So you might just want to have a little practice there if you like. So why don't I ask you a question? Let's just raise your little blue hand if you are anxious about your job and whether or not it's going to still be with us towards the end of the year. I'm going to raise my physical hand. Okay, well, everyone seems pretty confident, so you must all be absolutely brilliant and on point and indispensable. So let's assume that that isn't in our future. Well, I think that probably gets us done for the housekeeping. So what I'll do then is just start with that question: should the North of England try a universal basic income? And there's no other more obvious way to start than asking someone to have a crack at defining what we think universal basic income is. And I'm happy to say Chiwe's going to have a go for me. Chiwe Chahana, who is joining us from Sheffield today. And Chiwe, you're part of UBI Labs, aren't you? And I think there's a 2 in the name.
I am part of the UBI Lab network, yeah. So I'm a member of the UBI Lab Sheffield network, and I work for Opus Independents assigned to the UBI Lab network across the world.
Across the world, well, there you go. Yeah. So I've come to the right place then. So do you want to have a crack at it? So what is universal basic income?
So we define universal basic income as a regular and equal payment to everyone that could be paid every week or every month. And quite like basic state pension, it guarantees some financial security, or maybe the way you would see the NHS, for example, it guarantees healthcare for everybody. So it's a basic level of financial security for everybody. It just ensures that nobody falls through the cracks and everyone who needs support gets it.
And just to be absolutely clear, when we say universal, we really mean everyone, don't we? So it's not something that's just targeted at people who are, impoverished or underprivileged. It is everyone in society.
It's everybody. It's everybody, and it's unconditional, and it's not means tested. It's for everybody and anyone.
And again, just to sort of draw that out, when we say unconditional, this is no strings attached money. This is not money that someone says, and you have to spend it on green veg, or you can also spend it on things that make you happy.
Absolutely, yeah.
To have.
That just about sums it. It's definitely money with no strings attached to it. It just provides you with the basic financial security. That's what it does.
Right, and again, and we're talking about potentially something that could be for life. So you pass 18 and
yeah, we're talking about something that should be for life. So the reason we're calling for trials, and so just to answer the main sort of question, yes, I'm in support of a trial, and eventually would hope that something like that would actually be rolled out everywhere and become a permanent thing for life for everybody to have access to.
Okay, so we know what we're talking about. It's an unspecified amount of money, but it's coming to all of us from the age of 18, regardless of who you are and what you earn and what you're worth. And I suppose the next and most obvious question is, why would you get behind such a thing? And I'm just going to bring in another one of our guests straight away, Jack Haynes, who's joining us from Hull today. Jack, welcome.
Hi everyone. Hi, thanks for coming along. So I think
I'm just going to say Jack's just moved house, so he's in a box room. He hasn't got any pictures, but it's not because we've got him in a pin down room or anything.
No.
Jack, tell me, you're a Liberal Democrat councillor. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I believe you have advanced the cause of a pilot scheme in Hull. Could you just tell me a little bit about what you've done already?
Yeah, so as you said, David, I'm a councillor in Hull. Back in January, we moved a motion to Hull City Council that called for Hull to be the first place in the UK to pilot UBI, Universal Basic Income. We kind of did all of our research first, all of the philosophical stuff about what is this, what does it mean, and we thought, you know what, we should just trial it. That is the best way we can find out how feasible this thing is. We're all for evidence-based policy and that kind of thing. So we took it to the council. It got passed unanimously. That was Labour, Conservatives, and us all voting for it after we moved it. The government eventually said no, but they that was after a parliamentary question was tabled by a Lib Dem MP called Layla Moran, and we're kind of just moving on from there. I, with my colleague, set up one of the UBI Labs in Hull, and so we're just kind of a pressure group now trying to get more action on that.
So what's the status of the pilot? It's passed your local authority. What happens next?
So it passed that. So the motion passed our local authority. They have now got to set up a working group about that, and kind of discuss things like feasibility. We as well have set up a UBI lab in partnership with the rest around the country and the world. And it's kind of now the government has just rejected it. Now it's kind of carrying on that fight, carrying on that battle to try and put forward, evidence-based policy that shows maybe think again about this one.
And I'm sorry, I did you say that government has already moved to say we're not doing this?
Yeah, so our chief exec wrote to I think it was the Chancellor at the time, it was Shadi Javid, and they got back refusing it.
Right. Interesting.
So this was in January, so it's a very different world now, as we can all attest to through Zoom.
Well, yes, it's a very interesting moment, isn't it? We're all asking a lot of questions, I suppose, about how we all live in our communities, play a meaningful role in our communities, and we'll get to the why of this, I think, in a moment. But I mean, you can see that a lot of these community initiatives are things that could potentially flow from everyone having a basic income that they knew they could rely upon. I'm just going to bring in, if I could, Tracy Fishwick from Transform Lives. Tracy, could you just tell people what you do and who you work with, first of all?
Yeah, thank you. I've been working with unemployed people for the last 20 odd years across Liverpool City region and Greater Manchester as well, mostly across Liverpool. And that has given me, I suppose, a certain sort of insight and perspective into what's not working really. I think I've probably worked on programs that supported somewhere in the region of 40,000 people. So, you know, it's not just a handful of people that I've got experience of working with. And yeah, I suppose it's from that perspective that I'm really fascinated by this whole idea.
Have you gone deep? Do you have a full sense of what it is we're proposing or what might be proposed, and have you formed a view on whether you think it's something you would support?
Yes and no. I mean, I'm no expert on the inner workings of a universal basic income policy and all the ins and outs of how that would work. I suppose for me to just sort of take a step back and give a maybe broader sort of perspective, and a lot of people hopefully on this call will recognise some of the things that I'm in. You know, if we want to move to a society where we've got more equality, less inequality, you know, security, less debt, less stress, if we agree that those are all good things, and actually the way that our welfare support system works doesn't generate that. That we've got a welfare system where people's decisions and choices are hindered, I believe, in terms of their personal progress and growth rather than helped. And we've seen some of this that's been amplified in the last few months, I think. But this is something that I've been seeing for years. I think there's a notable shift over the last 10 or so years where we've moved to this whole idea that the welfare state, the benefits part of that, is actually a regime. And actually you can hear politicians and DWP and the media call it that it's some kind of regime, where when it was initially conceived, it was a support. It was about people's lives and security. There's
certainly a, you know, because of the types of things, the pressures that you talk about, there is a stigma attached, I suppose, to welfare.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I can see that's part of the thinking behind UBI, that it takes the sort of, it allows for dignity, right?
It levels that part of it, doesn't it? And you know, we've got again a system that is designed to almost catch the less than 0.5% of people who are seen to be cheating the benefit system.
Yes.
That everybody else is in this process where they've got to prove that they deserve help. All of endless forms, endless work capability assessments, appeals, which creates an awful lot of stress and anxiety. And it actually basic month a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I'm just gonna broaden the conversation in a moment. I'm just gonna say, just because I can see some of the chat, you know, people are asking some fairly fundamental questions about, well, what is it, and who would it impact? And it's worth saying, I think, that, you know, it's not a new idea. It's not some radical thing that's been dreamt up during lockdown. You know, I mean, it's. I think people trace the concept back all the way to the 18th century and Thomas Paine, and you know, he certainly advocated for a form of universal basic income. And then, you know, so that was from the kind of radical revolutionary sort of starting point. And then in the 20th century, you know, Milton Friedman, who you know, was advisor to Ronald Reagan and to Margaret Thatcher, he advocated for a form of universal basic income too. So you can see it's kind of movement across the spectrum there of politics. And you know, again, I mean, if you were paying attention at the end of last year and the start of this to the Democratic race for the presidential nomination, you'll have seen that Andrew Yang burst onto the scene as a really interesting candidate who, you know, quickly became the darling of the tech world, and his whole thing, his whole platform was based on what he called the Freedom Dividend, and that was an absolutely unashamed sort of version of universal basic income. And what he was advocating for was $1,000 a month paid to every American over the age of 18, and he and again, no strings attached. His arguments, you know, included that it was really born out of this notion that, you know, we were seeing this kind of wall of automation that was going to threaten a lot of jobs. And I think his estimate was a third of all American jobs would go to automation in the next decade, and nothing would come along quick enough to fill the gap. And so the argument was, give people universal basic income, and what it will do is give them agency to reskill, to you know, support people in their community, to practice good mental health. It was truthfully not a new idea under the sun, but pretty radical stuff for someone to build their platform upon, going into a campaign. And it, you know, I mean, it really got a lot of attention. Of course, he didn't make it, but you know, most people don't in the nomination sort of horse race. But anyway, it's in play, and I think he's articulated a very modern version of it. So I hope that gives people some context. And you know, obviously, if you want to challenge my version of that, then please do, because I'm not saying I've got it all right. Now, in the chat, I'm going to go first to if Paul Atherton is around. I wouldn't mind having a word with Paul. I think Paul's there's your hat, Paul, and there's the whole man. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, David. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. Where do we find you right now?
I am still in the homeless emergency hotel accommodation, more by fortune than by strategy.
Did you just
basically the entire Westminster Council went on holiday, so I've been left here by luck.
Oh wow! So I mean, I'm just going to give a little bit of background. Paul is someone who we've worked with at Tortoise, and he's been a really strong voice for homeless people in this country. And Paul found himself at the start of COVID living out at Heathrow Airport, didn't you? And there's a for those who don't know, there's an extraordinary, rather hidden from view community that makes Heathrow its home overnight. And Paul was fortunate enough eventually to get into emergency hotel accommodation in Westminster. But the last time I was in touch with you, it sounded like you were on the brink of being turfed out with no real solution.
I'm one of 7 left who actually have a local connection to Westminster out of the 253 that were housed. Mm-hmm. Most people have either been shipped out of the country, or placed back in hostel accommodation, but the council have a care of duty to me. So we're going through the usual bundle of process and bureaucracy, which will probably lead nowhere. But we're going through it nonetheless.
Right. So well, let's. All of this is personal. Let's personalize it. It sounds like, looking at you in the chat, you're an advocate of universal basic income. What would it mean to you?
Well, I think, you know, I've been talking about this for 2 decades, and I wrote to Ian Duncan Smith. I put the link in the chat room back in 2004, explaining how he could do it and why he should do it. I think one of the big differences now and why it's so feasible is the way we've changed money. So previously we used to have money in circulation, the Royal Mint would print it and the government would say how much it was going to be, you know, and previous to that, obviously it was linked to the gold reserve. We don't have that now. 97% of our money that's buzzing around in our circulation is created out of thin air by private banks. And we have no idea how much money is actually flushing around in our economies anymore, which means that the idea of printing money, which is fundamentally how you'd fund this, doesn't impact on anything. And that's a huge shift in a matter of 2 decades to when I was first talking about this. So it was all a bit idealistic 2 decades ago, where it's now really, really feasible. And the big difference for me would be that, you know, ultimately, you know, I've suggested 24,000. I simply plucked that from the average UK salary. But actually, if you look at most sort of benefits in central London, that would be just about enough to cover your rent, feed yourself, and keep yourself clothed and clean, which is really what it's about. It's about a basic income sufficient enough for you to survive. So in my instance, I'd be able to organize my own accommodation. I wouldn't be reliant on anybody else. I wouldn't be having to go through all the nonsense that I am going through. I could simply fix my problem and then continue to do all the things that I have been doing without the hindrance of jumping through hoops. As you know, I suffer with chronic fatigue syndrome, so I get disability benefits, and all of these other things would just completely disappear. So my focus could purely be on being a productive member of society. The problem I think we fall into a trap of is this wage slavery that we talked about in the chat room.
Interesting. All right. Well, thank you for that, Paul. I'm going to start with next Daniel Dipper, if he's around. Daniel, how are you doing?
Hello. Yeah, I'm all right.
Yeah, good. Nice to see you. So tell me, are you instinctively for or against? I'm sensing from the chat that you're worried about deficits and
yeah, I'm quite kind of concerned about who's going to pay for it. I mean, I could actually see a system which I possibly could support, but I'm very cautious about it. But it would have to be, we'd have to change our whole funding model of our country so that instead of the government paying for things like schools or hospitals and that sort of thing, literally the consumer would have the money. So it's kind of quite a Thatcher idea in terms of that she was trying to make it the hospital trusts would mean that the money would follow the person as such. So the better trust would be rewarded with the money, but it still doesn't quite work that way. Whereas if everyone had that money, I mean, to me, I'm not sure how we'd pay for it unless literally the government provided less of those services directly and you would have to pay for our free schools, but by using some of this universal basic income. I think it's the only sort of way I could see it in a balanced budget world.
Well, I can tell you what, again, the most recent and vocal proponent of this, Andrew Yang, the way he said it would work in the US, he basically proposed 4 ways of paying for it. One was that they would introduce VAT, which obviously we already have here. He would take money that was all the money currently spent on welfare would be put in the pot, and he argues that new revenue would come into the economy because when all of us were given our notional $1,000 a month, we'd go and spend it. So there would be an economic boost. And then he also talked about taxes on top earners and on pollution. So it's progressive taxes, I suppose, some universal taxes on spending, the pot of money you spend on welfare, and arguably you know, the engine that you give that little bit of boost to the economy. So and one could, you know, where do you stop doing that? You could choose not to spend on anything that you didn't favor, like defense maybe, and choose to spend that on something else. So it's, you know, you can sort of see how there might be ways of balancing. But I'm gonna just whiz back round a little bit, and I'm going to go back to Hull initially. Jack, have you said you're doing a feasibility study? I don't know how far down the line you've got, but have you considered things like how much should it be, where would your pilot be, and you know, how would you fund it?
What I'd say first is that it's a huge achievement that the movement's got to this point where there's people now talking about feasibility, how would it work, who's going to pilot it, and that kind of thing. Obviously, I'm not just going to stick a random figure out in the air because I think it just needs to be done by experts first. I know through some of my bubbles, the idea is that you do this on top of everything else. You pay for it through progressive taxation and, you know, some kind of more progressive tax through the environment and that kind of thing. But more importantly, like, UBI is about a mood shift. It's about a shift towards an economy that puts welfare first and well-being first, rather than, you know, GDP, deficits, funding, all the rest of it. The UBI is very much something part of a bigger picture of making sure people aren't just left behind by a broken system that I've seen in Hull has affected so many. And so we can eventually start moving forward and having a bit more of a think about who we are and who our state wants people to govern as people.
So I take from that you at this point you're holding up your hands and saying, I don't have numbers and I don't know scale. Is that correct?
Yeah. So in Hull, it was anywhere from £50 to £150 a week. Those were the kind of like ballpark figures. But that's where the debate needs to be now. You're completely right, David. We need to start talking about, if this is going to be a serious proposal, and it is across the water and it has been in Finland, then how much are the government willing to put forward to do this and do this right?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Finland. We'll come back to Finland. All right, so now then, William Jeremy, you've got your hand up. What do you want to say? Hey, William. Have we unmuted William? Can we hear from William?
Yep.
Yeah, there you go. How are you doing? Yes.
Excellent. Yes, it's well, I mean, clearly it's not only a brilliant idea, but it could well be particularly because of Corona crisis, but also with the wider crises around the world, an idea whose time has come. But as ever, the big questions are how much, who pays, and what are the taxation methods that societies will have to agree to in order to fund it. But certainly with the massive issues that are confronting, you know, the global society, like, as we've mentioned, automation, climate change, elderly care, lifelong education, across the sort of socio-economic east, you can see why this is a new way of bringing the social compact that Beveridge introduced post-war. So it's a brilliant concept, but how do we politically get you know, enough wind beneath its sails, as it were?
And what do you think the biggest challenge to that would be? Do you see it as an ideological issue that, for instance, the right couldn't get behind, or do you see it as?
Oh, I think the right could. I think just as the right, the centre right certainly learnt to embrace the health service, learnt to embrace unemployment benefit. What's interesting about all that radical post-war legislation, which changed the world, is that it was ushered in by the Attlee government, which was essentially conservative with a small c. You might remember Wilson used to say that socialism was what the Labour Party did in government, and then what would tend to happen is the Conservatives would come in having adopted those ideas as a kind of consensus.
Yes, and clearly, well, certainly, that's sort of where the Conservative government finds themselves now, isn't it? That they're
absolutely, because we're all Keynesians now.
Ideas that would have been unimaginutopia for them.
Anathema for a long time. Yes.
Right. I'm going to come to who wants to speak up about Utopia for Realists. I can see that there's about 3 people in the margins in the chat who are speaking up for that great volume. So I wonder who fancies having a crack at that. Ed Gregg, were you one of the utopians?
I was one of the ones, and now I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to give.
You don't have to. I mean, honestly, you don't have to give us the précis. But
Utopia for Realists, but yeah, I think. I mean, so I'm Ed Gregg. I'm the chief disruptor for Deloitte, and my team's job is to work with new technologies and look at how we can get them delivering a tangible impact as quickly as possible to our clients and ourselves and kind of society at large. And I mean, our motto is fall in love with the problem, not in love with the solution. And I think some people have touched on that already in terms of how we look at the problem that this is trying to solve, and we don't are very clear about that, which I think Bregman is in Utopia for Realists. I think he's quite pragmatic about not necessarily falling in love with specific solutions, but talking about the need to kind of experiment and look for the correct route forward in that way. But I do, I think it's a good it's a good book. I mean, definitely people should read it. Me trying to summarize it here would be a poor.
You've done more than enough for the debate by just introducing your title. Are you really a chief disruptor?
I really am the chief disruptor. And I mean, it's something that, so I mean, we one of the things that Bregman talks about as being a driver for this and the necessity for this is the mass unemployment that is potentially going to result from kind of widespread adoption of automation. And I think that the conservative estimates for that are 9%. So there was a study came out recently that said it's only going to be 9%. It's not going to be the 30% that some people are talking about, but 9% is for that to be the conservative estimate for technological unemployment. I think is that's still a big number. And a lot of people say, well, look, we've always invented new jobs. But again, I think the struggle here is, whereas it was obvious in the past where those new jobs were going to come from, I think now it is less obvious where particularly those are going to come from. And the ones that we're seeing are very precarious and are not giving people the security that they need to go forward. So,
And particularly when you can see service industry jobs being automated, it's particularly anxiety inducing, isn't it? And I think one of the things that I found quite persuasive about Andrew Yang when he was on the stump was the way he talked about, you know, this as a mechanism for everybody gaining from technological innovation, not just companies and not just senior people in companies, but the entirety of the population getting a bump from it. Joanne Brearley is a well-read kind of an individual in the chat. Joanne, are you around? Hello.
Hi. Yeah, I'm not very well.
Well, you're dropping some very good books in there. So you've talked about Mike Berners-Lee book. There's no Planet B. And you said again, just to in case people haven't seen it, you said you used to be a total skeptic on UBI. Where are you now?
I suppose I've read things about it for a couple of years now, and I just never really got it. It never clicked. But reading Mike's book, his book is about how we solve all the issues in the world. You know, climate change, due to inequality and racism, and everything else in between. And it's a really great synopsis of like touch point of all of those issues. And at the back of the book, he goes into values. And one of the things he talks about values being the thing that will, without values, all the rest of it we might as well forget about, because if good values and truth and are the key to all of it. But he talks about how UBI could be a way for us to kind of cut away the really worst parts of the lowest sector of society, where people are pretty much in slave labour here in the UK, in really poorly paid jobs, and they're stuck in these routines of being paid the lowest possible wage that they can be paid, and never being able to break out of a spiral. So and also that if we're going to transition to a new kind of green economy and get to net zero by 2050 as a nation, we're going to have to start changing the way that we do things and allowing people to be able to change their habits and their working patterns to support that, in a way that if people were able, for example, to say work 25% less of the week and they could use that time to volunteer, it would be so much more beneficial to the way that people can live in towns and say start growing food or helping vulnerable people because they want to, not because it has to be a paid job that they have to fill their time doing to pay their mortgage. And I mentioned that maybe Blackpool's a good place to start with a UBI trial. That's where I'm from originally. I don't live there now. Because 8 of the 10 poorest wards in the UK are in Blackpool. And so there's a lot of problems in Blackpool, a lot of societal problems, and a lot of people. It's a fabulous place, but a lot of people do struggle. But
I noticed the other day that there was a bit of an opinion poll from people who live in Blackpool, and so many of them said they didn't want the tourists to return, even though tourists bring nearly all of the income. Which, was slightly contradictory. Yes, that's interesting. Well, we'll get to in a minute, I think. Well, what does it look like, a pilot? I'm going to press Jack on, even if he hasn't finished his feasibility study. We'll go back there in a minute. But could I bring Chiwe back in? Because Chiwe said you had a bit of a global read on UBI Lab as well, and I'm wondering who's having a go and what looks promising.
So one of the ones that have already been mentioned, obviously, is the one in Finland already. So that was that was promising. It produced quite promising result. And contrary to what the common arguments around universal basic income are, that it would discourage people from working, actually there was a slight, it showed that there was improvement slightly in people actually applying for jobs and getting jobs, but also mental health wise, people's mental health improved in a very similar way. That those were the findings in recent findings in Kenya, as well as in Namibia. So there are quite a lot of those that have shown that, contrary to what people's fears have been, people are actually encouraged to get back into work, they fit back into the economy, and they don't fall through the poverty gap that everybody is falling through at the moment, especially with COVID. And
again, I must admit, I know that much about the Finland experiment. What I've read about it is that it sort of lasted for a couple of years, and it wasn't truly universal, was it? It sort of focused on people who were more disadvantaged, and so you didn't have that weird dissonance that comes from, you know, everyone on the salary scale getting this no strings attached payment. Have I understood that correctly?
I'm actually not sure I understand it any better than you in that particular context. What I do know is that the people were unemployed that were part of that trial.
Let's go back to Tracy. I wonder, as the conversation's gone on, Tracy, where you're at and what you think I wonder if I could just ask you, just very simply, what do you see as the main benefits, and what do you see as the potential drawbacks of the idea?
Well, I think a lot of people have either said it or alluded to it, but I think that where we are currently is a place where quite often, when we're talking about unemployed people, and we're going to see a lot more in the coming months and for a number of years, this is going to be something, you know, unprecedented levels that we've seen. And in the context of that, where somebody else mentioned about, you know, the kind of jobs that are being created, you know, the government likes to talk about record employment levels, but how many of those jobs were in the gig economy and zero contracts? And the toxic mix of that and universal credit, and the way that that is set up it almost penalizes people for trying get out of that situation, and we see that time and again. And so we need to move away from asking people to almost demonstrate all the time, what are the things you can't do in order to keep your disability benefit? Like, tell us how bad it is, you know, start believing even more that you can't do something. It's completely crazy. We need to be in a place, someone talked about values, and I think trust is a massive thing, that we've lost a lot of trust. What we need, where people feel as though they're being encouraged to think about what they can do, and to make steps towards that. And I can give you loads of examples. One example is somebody that we're working with currently who has been caring for his autistic son for 18 years. He doesnn't have really a relevant recent work history, but he's fantastically skilled and talented. He's a wonderful artist. But if he makes art and sells it and makes a bit of money, that's taken into account, that's income. But the money that he spends to make the art, the materials, you know, that doesn't come into it. The costs don't come into it. And so actually people just end up really stuck. Whereas if it was a universal basic income, people would be able to be creative and to find sometimes their own solutions out of the situation that they're in. And I think that what we've created is this very negative, deficit-based, stuck place. But what we don't want is 9% more or millions more people
feeling that, leading that dispirited sort of life. I'm just gonna thank you for that, really. That's great. And let me go to, is Alison Atkinson Phillips there? Because you're expressing a great deal of enthusiasm for UBI. And hey, how are you doing, Alison? And go on. What's appealing to you, and what do you think are the potential net gains that we might make?
So I'm a researcher at Newcastle University, and for the last couple of years I've been researching at the West End Food Bank there, looking at the impact of food poverty on people. And I just see how ground down people are by the current system. So, universal credit makes people sick. And then the flow-on effects of that on this pressure on our health system, on people's lives, is pretty terrible. So, I'm not an economist, but from what I have seen and read, I think that universal basic income would, have a lot of flow-on effects. There's a couple of people I think have said you need to look at the net cost rather than the gross cost. Because once people are not kind of ground down in poverty, then they're not suffering the health impacts of that poverty. And that's going to have a net positive impact on our health system. So that's one of the reasons I'm pretty excited about the idea.
There might be a benefit for the state in less need, arguably, on the health service side of things. I wonder, is anybody at this point, we've got about 12 minutes to go. What about if you were to use your blue hands to just flush yourself out? Is anyone a true skeptic about UBI at this point? You're too nice. What's going on? So no one's willing to. Well, maybe Daniel. Look, we were talking to Daniel earlier. Daniel, has your view crystallized in the course of this conversation?
To me, I think there's far too many unanswered questions for me to be persuaded by. Don't get me wrong, I think that we do have problems in society, and it shouldn't be a case that, people are literally living in absolute poverty as such because, they can't afford anything. But to me, that means that our current system is not giving enough money, or it's not giving it in a targeted way. So to me, I would look at what can we do to fix the system we've got currently before, as I'd kind of call it, throwing out the whole sort of kitchen or the bathroom or whatever, actually try and fix what we've got first, because actually, to me, it just sounds like the level's too low. And yeah, I'm just not sure how we're paying for it still. That's something that quite concerns me. I think as well, one of the things I'm thinking about is if everyone has more money, don't get me wrong, it will improve people's lives in the short term, but I'm just thinking in the long term, surely average costs would just rise, because every time wages go up, so do prices.
Well,
so actually,
there's an argument. There's certainly an argument which is adjacent to that, which is that some employers might just artificially, depress the salaries that they offer because they think, well, you're already getting 12 grand, as a starting point. So there is certainly an element of risk there. I think it's really interesting that it sounds to me like you're a skeptic on how it's paid for. That seems to be the heart of your main issue.
Yeah, it has paid for and what impact it would have.
But I do think it's interesting that Tracy's counter argument clearly is, this system actually does need to be fundamentally reformed, and that it has a sickness at its heart, and it's it's founded in a really judgmental mindset. I suppose that seems to be the argument. Now, I wonder, is anybody, let's just think about these blue hands again, look at all these now, blimey. All right, Jill Ruddock, where are you? Where do you stand at the moment?
I'm here. Yes, I agree absolutely that all these problems that the lady was talking about need to be addressed. But I cannot get past the idea that people who really don't need the money would get it. And I can't see that there's any social justice in that. unless it was clawed back by taxation. But then, you know, why give it out to take it back? I really don't feel that it should be universal.
I agree.
That's my
view. It's a really challenging head-spinning idea, isn't it? I mean, you know, why would you give Ian Duncan Smith 12 grand a year? Why would you give, you know, Boris Johnson 12 grand a year? But that would be what you'd be envisaging if it was truly universal. However, I guess that if you then turn your thoughts to the question of how do you pay for this thing, it's likely that it is going to be clawed back through taxation, and the justification I think that I've heard both today and before on this is that firstly, it's easy to administer if it's universal, and secondly, it takes the stigma away from welfare. That which is to Tracy's point, really. I don't think we've heard from anybody in Cumbria. Caroline Richardson is going to represent, I'm hoping. There you are. Hello.
Hello.
What's on your mind?
Well, several things, but most people keep answering them before.
Go on. You can put your own spin on
it. Out today is a brief report that Simon Duffy and I have done, and it's a short report, part of a much longer report that addresses a lot of the issues. I think one thing that people are fixated on is an actual flat rate amount of money for everybody, regardless of circumstances. And I don't feel that actually works. I think we need to give a basic income based on basic needs, and the needs may be different for each type of household unit. I know all the other questions about how would we pay for this, and they're all very valid questions. What I am struggling with is that while we can win the debate on paper and say the why, people are really backing off from the how, and no one is giving, well, not many people are giving any sort of forensic examination of how they come to a certain amount of money.
Is that what's the nature of the report you've done? Is that getting to any of this?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's
basically
explaining a bolt-on method that's based on a minimum income standard, which in itself is based on people's needs. So it splits the benefit effectively for a calculation purpose. It splits the benefit into 4 different groups. So you get a personal allowance, you get a house allowance, which I've never seen anybody else suggest. So you get an allowance for your household unit that covers household bills. You get things like a travel allowance, and you also get like a cultural and participation allowance, which allows you to go out.
That starts to sound like about 5 different bits of means testing. Is that what
no, because there would be no means testing on it at all whatsoever. You would literally tick what type of house you are. So single person in rented accommodation. That's it. That's all you would need.
And you qualify. So you're advocating. So if there are 10 categories and you score in 8 of them, you get paid on a sliding scale, something like that.
Well, you get an amount for each one. So if you're a married couple living in your own home with 4 children, aged 2 under 5, 1 under 10, and 1 at 19, then they all would also attract a sum of money.
I suppose that even though you say that isn't means tested, I can imagine a whole bureaucracy that would have to grow up around it to check whether or not you were telling the truth. Would you have to?
I don't know,
because evidence or something.
Well, at the moment, you know, if you there always is some sort of checks and balances, and things in people's lives change, and if you have different circumstances, they need to be taken into account. So, for example, the circumstances of a person who can work are very different to a person who can't work through ill health or age. Either they're too young to work or too old to work, but they'll have additional needs on top of that. So a basic income is to protect you, and it's a springboard for you to go and do other things, to do work or whatever. So I think what people start looking at is they forget this is a basic income. This is to stop you falling into horrendous situations of being homeless, not having enough food.
So that might not be pitched quite at the level that Paul suggested earlier, but I've seen someone else advocate for half of that.
The figures that I've run out at the moment, which are they're not that rough. They were based on Joseph Rowntree Foundation minimum income standards. And a single person would be getting somewhere in the region of £157 a week, plus a local housing allowance. And then we have a system of progressive taxation to take it back once people are earning a certain amount, as yet to be decided. Whereas somebody who lived in a couple would get a different amount.
Got it,
They would still get the same housing element, because
Caroline, I'm just
in the house isn't any more than one person in the house. So you get rid of that unfairness of literally overpaying people or underpaying them.
I'm just going to stop you there because we're slightly running out of time. I'm going to, if I could, I'm just going to quickly come back to Jack, and then I'd like to just see, what the next steps are really. That's to take us out. The last couple of contributions. How do you make flesh what you think is a good idea? And I think Jack's muted again.
Hear me now?
Yeah, go for it. So yes,
cool.
How do we make flesh what you're convinced is a good idea for Hull?
We've just got to. This is going to sound really unprofessional and unfounded. We've just got to get on with it. We've just got to,
Well, that's half of that, isn't it? Keep showing up.
Because there is just endless streams of questions, and we will not be able to get anywhere if a place that is relatively deprived, has a lot of people falling underneath the barrier of poverty, and we have to try this thing, because ultimately we can keep asking these questions and we can keep theorizing and researching, but we have to have a pilot. And the reason this discussion is about having a pilot in the north is because the UBI Lab network is, for the most part, northerners saying to their councils, to their government, look, this system has failed us for so long. We need something different. We need something progressive and radical, and we need something that will give answers to the people who, for so many years, have been made vulnerable by the state, been let down by the state. And you see it day to day, especially here in Hull, especially up north.
So you're just going to get on with it, and I admire that. You get knocked back and you say, well, okay, let's just carry on. Now, Chiwe, I'm just going to come back to you as a last remark, really, if we could, having guided us into this conversation. I wonder if you could just take us out by giving anyone who's interested a sense of what they can do next, and if they want to do it with the lab network, how that goes.
All right, thanks a lot. It's been lovely listening to everyone. So you can join, you can have a look at our website. It's ubilabnetwork.org, and you could look at how you could become a member or contribute to the conversations that are ongoing. I've also posted a survey in the chat that would really like to get feedback on, especially that it would have an effect on what a UBI could look like for disabled people. So there are quite a lot of studies going on around. There's also papers that different labs are working on, and also just different conversations that are taking place in various labs. So have a look. So we've got non-geographic labs, and we've also got geographic labs. If you go on our website, you should be able to get more information.
All right. Well, I mean, I will say, I feel like I've come out of the conversation really enthused by the radical nature of again, it's another moment where you say we can take the opportunity during this pandemic to challenge received wisdom. And if it's clear that the welfare state costs a lot of money, is debilitating to many people in an emotional and physical way and upsets a lot of other people who think it's too much money, then why not rethink it, and why not, after a time when we've all been tested emotionally, do it with different presumptions, and we can all perhaps rally around the idea that we think the importance of community and the importance of people who do jobs in the community have been heightened, but it's more than about applause, and it's more than even a sort of below inflation pay rise. I think it strikes me that there's little to lose in having an experiment in a place like Hull, and so why not have a go? But I think there are an abundance of questions around how you pay for it and how it feels when Ian Duncan Smith gets a check every month. But maybe that's a price worth paying, and we shall see. But I will say thank you so much to the People's Powerhouse for helping us put on this conversation. I hope you've found lots to chew on, and we'll continue the conversations afterwards. I think the task for us now is to go away and digest these several sessions we've had, and just think about how power and agency can move back into communities. And I know somebody was sort of slightly bridling at the idea of why you're just talking about the North with this in mind, because we can, I suppose, and I'm happy that we are. But I do feel we need to think hard about how we live next, and there are lots of policy implications for that. And these set of conversations have given us a good framework. And if bear in mind we've got all of your contact details, don't be too surprised if I'm just dropping you an email to say, okay, let's just expand on that. So thanks so much. We can't give ourselves a physical hug, but we can manage a digital one. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I wish you all the best, and we'll see you soon.